Today we're going to turn this 170-pound swivel jaw bench vise into the kind of tool that every shop needs to have. We're going to clean it up, do a little bit of grinding on it, a little bit of machining on some of the parts, and then make ourselves a super heavy base. So let's get right into it. The first thing to do is to get it into some WD-40 Specialist Rust Removing Soak. Now, this video is sponsored by WD-40, and this is my kind of go-to method for kind of removing the rust from an old vise like this. Now you can see I poured some brand new solution into this 30-gallon barrel, and then I poured some used solution that I had left over from some previous projects. Now this vise, like I mentioned, is really heavy at 170 pounds, so I'm just sort of sick of lifting it, so I'm going to go ahead and use the hoist to get it up on this little stool so I can start to disassemble it and get it into that vat of solution. So this thing's actually pretty tight but somewhat functional. The big problem with these vices is getting that pin out, so we're going to use some WD-40 Specialist penetrant spray once the pin is released to get the swivel jaw to actually free up so we can take it apart. Now you may have seen me restore another one of these vices in the past, and you know I had to take a lot of time and energy to get the pin out on this one. It was able to pop out with a pair of pliers, and I just used a couple of brass hammers to get that swivel jaw loose, and then just used a big wrench to get this bottom bolt off so that I could take the swivel base off. Now this is a Prentice number 22 vise. This is a pretty highly coveted swivel jaw, swivel base vise made probably about 100 years ago in New York. And what I really like about these vices is the fact that the swivel jaw can grab tapered and uneven material really well. And I really like having these in the shop. I currently keep the last one I restored on my welding table, but I want one that I can keep in the machine shop, sort of in my sort of general fabricating area, and I can use it to kind of grind things and work on things over in that part of the shop. So again, we just need to get this thing totally disassembled so that we can go ahead and get it in the rust removing soak. And what you're seeing here is actually the pivot pin, which is pretty seized up, and I decided to just leave it and let the rust removing soak do its thing. Now I cut the handle off right over on the ball end so that I could unscrew the meatball and get this thing into the vat pretty easily. Now this has a modern collar with some set screws in it, unlike some of the older vices which used a little more archaic of a system. Now you can see I'm just sort of leaving this stuff in that soak. Now the big problem, the only issue I've ever had with this is finding a vessel large enough to actually put the parts in, and by switching to this larger 30-gallon pail, it's been really helpful for kind of doing these types of operations. Now you'll see that, like I said, some of the solution I'm using is brand new and some of it is used, but what's great about this WD-40 Specialist Rust Removing Soak is that you can use it over and over again. So I keep this stuff around and I mix it up as I need to, pour it from different 5-gallon pails or into the 30-gallon pail as I need it, and then after just 2 days in the soak, it's able to be removed and washed off. Now it's pretty cold in my shop right now, and heat does help this solution work faster, so I gave it that extra day, but normally I just let it sit overnight. Now immediately you can see how much cleaner all these parts are. They have this kind of nice dull gray look, and all of that rust has been removed by the solution. This is a really effective and efficient way to remove rust from anything that is old and rusty, and I really like it. Now after you're done, you're going to wash it off with some just regular old water, and I do that over another 5-gallon pail just to sort of collect that solution because it's about 10 degrees outside Fahrenheit while I'm doing this, so I don't really want to create a bunch of ice. Now once it's sprayed down, you're just going to go ahead and dry it off, and you can see I'm sort of collecting the parts, and you can really get an idea of the scale of this vise as it's pretty huge. Every part takes up a good percentage of this workbench, and you can see just how nice and clean all those parts are. I'm using some WD-40 Specialist degreaser to just sort of clean everything up and get it nice and dry. You don't want to leave this stuff after the rust's been removed wet, because it will then flash rust just from the humidity, because all of that rust, that sort of protective oxide layer, is gone. With all that done, I can bring it over to the downdraft table and I can start cleaning up all the movable parts so I can get this thing back assembled and back into service. Now, one of the critical parts on a vise like this are these kind of friction surfaces. So anywhere that the two pieces of metal are going to connect, I want those to be nice and clean. So I use the Scotch-Brite pad there, and I'm going to be using this little die grinder with a spiral sandpaper pad that I'm just going to be cleaning up all these pivot locks and then start working on the actual pivot jaw itself. Now the pivot jaw wasn't functional, it wouldn't travel the whole way, so I grabbed a nice double cut burr and I started grinding a little bit away at that channel and track just sort of cleaning things up, trying not to take off too much material. And I really like a nice double cut burr from this. These are from Faird. They do a great job. Then I can go ahead and take a light grinding wheel and just sort of clean up those wear surfaces so that everything is nice and smooth and there's no rust, creating a rough travel. You can see how easily it moves, and you can see how nicely that pin goes in. It needs a little bit of cleaning up itself so that it'll go in and out nicely. I do that over on the bench grinder with a wire wheel and the grinding stone. Now you can see how nicely it goes in and how nice that swivel jaw works. I use a little bit of 3-in-1 oil on the base, just as a light oil that won't gum up over time, to make sure that the travel is going to be nice and smooth. Now the nut and washer, the bolt and washer that are going in the bottom, are also going to wear against each other. So again, I ground that nice and smooth and then put a little bit of 3-in-1 oil in there so that it would have a nice, good fit and not give me any moving resistance. Now, the way that you lock the swivel on this is with this spring-loaded pin, and it can be pretty difficult to open if you don't have good leverage. So you can see me using the wrench there, but once everything's lubricated up in the end, you're going to see that it works really well. Now, while the vise is not fully assembled, I use that to my advantage, and I trace out on this 1/2-inch plate the profile of the base. Now, we're going to cut that out later using the torch, but for now, we're going to spend a little bit of time in the machine shop cleaning up the screw and making that much better and much more functional. Now, the screw had a lot of wear and kind of scars on it from, I guess, previous use. I think people had maybe taken this vise apart a couple times and put it back together. So I put some brass soft jaw covers in my lathe, and you can see all the scars on the kind of smooth part of the screw. Now I'm just going to take off a little bit of material here. You can see it's not really that square. It's got a little bit of a bend to it. So I'm really just sort of scraping off material. I probably could have done this with a grinder if I didn't have a lathe, but I thought it'd be a little more precise if I did it on the lathe and kind of get it all round again. Now, I'm not looking for this to be perfect. It's not going to actually touch anything. The only thing that this smooth section does is kind of pass through a casting. And there's a ton of tolerance within that casting in the actual vise body, so I don't have to worry about doing this in a very precise way. I do, however, want to flatten off the backside of what's called the meatball. Later on, I'm going to be adding a big spring and a collar and some thrust bearings to make this basically like a speed vise. And you'll see that later on in the video. So I wanted to make sure that I cleaned up the inside of that meatball face so that the spring would have a nice surface to kind of bear against. So the other thing that was wrong with this vise was the handle was really wallowed out. It's about a 7/8 bar that you would be using to kind of turn this vise, but that hole had wallowed out to well over an inch. So I brought it over to the milling machine and I set up a boring bar to take a couple passes out of it and just open it up so that I could put in an oil light bronze bushing that would get me much closer to the actual handle diameter and just take a lot of the slop out of the vise. That was a pretty easy process. I just sort of took my steps, moved back out. Originally, when I started, I remember the hole was just about 1 inch in diameter, and when I was done, I made it a little bit over 1.25 inches so that I could put this bronze bushing material you can sort of see in the background once I turned it down. Now, I'm not so worried about the surface finish on the inside of this because I actually wanted to have a little bit of grip to it. And I had a broken insert on this lathe tool, and I really got a terrible surface finish on this oil light bronze. But this is actually like an oil impregnated material. So you'll see when we heat it up and put it inside the handle, it's actually going to like kind of leak some oil out of it, which is actually like kind of a self-lubricating feature of it, which will make it great for this application. It's not very strong, so obviously it could get worn out, but it'd be easy to press it out and put in a new one if I wanted to. Once I had it turned down to approximately the right diameter and I drilled a hole in it, I could just use the parting tool to cut it off, and then we could bring it over to the arbor press and we can press it in. Over on the arbor press, I needed to heat up the end of the meatball a little bit just so that I would have a little bit more room to press this piece in. And I noticed I did sort of undersize a little bit of it, so you see it was a little sloppy of a fit at the beginning, but then the other kind of 3/4 of it fit in really nice and tight, and you can see a little bit of that oil come out. Now, one of the other things that was wrong with this handle was that it was pretty badly bent, so I heated it up with the induction forge, and then I put it over in this 6-inch vise and just sort of tightened down on it and kind of rotated it as I went, and wound up actually getting a really nice fit and getting it nice and bent, nice and straight, so that it'll work really well inside that handle as it is. I let it cool in the vise so it wouldn't bend back, and then I put it in some water. Now back over on the lathe, I wanted to clean up the handle a little bit, so what I did was I faced off the end, and then I drilled a spotting hole in it. Now you'll wonder, how am I going to get the ball end that I cut off back on? And we're going to be drilling and tapping that, but I wanted to turn this kind of smooth first and grind it with the sort of belt grinder that I have set up on my angle grinder. So I grabbed the other ball end, put it in a live center on the other side, and then you can see I'm using this angle grinder attachment, which is like a pipe polishing tool. Done a couple videos about these in the past, and that cleaned it up really nicely. You can see the way it slips in and out of that bushing on the end of the meatball now really well. Now, one of the things I want to add to this vise is actually a little threaded hole in the end of the meatball so that I could put in a screw, a set screw, that would allow this vise to essentially become a speed vise. And you'll see that later on in the video, but basically by putting a set screw here on the end, you can tighten it down and you can lock the handle in place so that it's much less mass that you have to turn around if you want to quickly open or close the vise. Now, I found online that I could get some M5 metric ball bearing ended set screws, so I tapped it with an M5, and then I just put a bolt in there for now, just temporarily. Now, as I said, I drilled out the end of the other part of the handle, and I'm going to do the same thing with the ball. I'm going to face it off and drill it out and tap it so that I can just use some threaded rod to actually reconnect the handle. This way, if I ever want to do any service to the handle or if I wanted to change it out, I can easily take it apart without having to cut it. Most people would sort of just weld this ball back on and grind it, but I wanted it to be a little more adjustable if I ever wanted to change things in the future. I wanted to go with a nice strong thread, so I went with some 1/2 inch 13, and I just tapped it with a spiral tap by hand in the lathe. Going back to the handle, you can see where I had drilled it out for the live center, and now I'm going to just drill it out with the drill size and then go ahead and tap it with a spiral tap. I'm using the lathe chuck, sort of just manually turning it by hand, because at this size with a blind hole, I don't want to risk breaking the tap. That'd be a real pain to get out. You can see my other Prentice 22 right here on the bench with the brass jaws, and I can just tighten in a 1/2 inch bolt, then cut it off with the little bandsaw. I'll grind the edges so there's no bad burrs, and then I'll just tighten up that ball on there and then clean it up on the wire wheel. With all that done, I can go ahead and grind away what's left of the oil light bronze bushing that was sticking out. And the other nice thing about having this set screw in the end is it'll keep that oil light bushing from ever potentially moving. Now here's the part where we make the speed vise. So you saw right there I had a thrust bearing and washer. It's a washer, then a bearing, then another washer. And then I've got this really heavy spring. So what I'm going to do is basically measure for how long that spring needs to be. Then I can go ahead and cut it and then reinstall the collar. So more or less what you're doing here is you're putting a constant light pressure on the thrust bearings, which is going to allow them to sort of take any of the slop out of the screw and make this vise really fast and smooth. It's a pretty incredible process when you see it work, because this vise is well over 100 years old. It's clearly been pretty well abused, and it's going to act as though it's brand new, probably better than most brand new vises that you could buy off the shelf right now once we do this little modification. You could really do this to a lot of different types of vices, so I encourage you to give it a try if you ever wanted your vise to work really functionally. The other thing I have to do is replace the pin that's holding the screw box, and now you're going to be able to see the way this vise operates. I put the handle back on, put that on there, and now look at that. You can literally just move this with one finger. You can kind of flick it, and it'll move really quickly. And that's the results of that bearing, the thrust washers, and then that set screw. The vise now works more or less better than the day that it was made, and I'm really happy with the action that I got out of it. With all that done, I'll grab that 1/2 inch plate that we marked out before, and I'm going to set up my cutting torch so I can cut out a nice base that I'm going to be welding some ears to so that I can get it on the bottom of this vise. Now, I don't normally cut with my gas axe, but it was really nice to do it. This is a Harris torch, the pipeliner kit, and I do get left with a little bit of a rough edge, so I'm going to go ahead and clean that up. And for that, I'm using the new Fared CC Grind View disc. I just sort of took some of the burrs off so that I could mark for my holes and mark where the actual edge of the base is with a Sharpie so I can grind to it. I want this to be a really nice and kind of flush fit, so I go ahead and I grind to the Sharpie line that I just got by tracing the base on after the flame cut was done. Now, if you look closely at this grinding disc, you'll notice that you can see through it as I'm grinding. This is the new Fared CC Grind View. It has little holes in it so that you can actually see what you're grinding as you're doing it, but it has the same Victograin super aggressive grinding media that some of my other favorite discs do. So it was really nice to use that so I could see exactly where I was going. And then once that was done, I could go back over to the welding table and I could punch with my self-centering transfer punch where I needed to drill these holes for the bolts. Now I'm going to wind up actually drilling and tapping this so that I could put some 1/2-inch hardware in there. So I go through the same process of kind of drilling up to what I did on the other sections. I'm using some Anchor Lube paste as a cutting lubricant on this. This is something that's been relatively new to my shop. Normally I would have just used an oil, but I've been really liking using the Anchor Lube because it sticks a lot better than a regular oil does, and I feel like it gives me a lot better cooling options and actually keeps my bits from breaking and getting dull. With all that done, I grabbed a piece of 3/8 plate and the fine beveler to give it a nice bevel that I can weld to, and then I marked out where I'm going to cut it so I can make some sides for this plate. I'm using a metal cutting circular saw to cut up this 3/8 plate, and if you've watched any of my other videos, you know this is my favorite way to process plate. I've got that nice bevel on there that's really going to allow for the welding of this 3/8 to 1/2 inch to go nice and smoothly. Now I picked up this awesome cast iron machine base on Facebook Marketplace. It's super heavy at about 175 pounds itself, and with that on there, I'm going to be able to kind of really make a stout mounting point for this vise. Now, I thought about welding this plate to the top, but this is cast iron. I think it has a piece of real steel forge welded into the top, but I thought it'd be better to drill and tap the sides of it and actually put this plate on, so if I ever wanted to change the vise out, I wouldn't be cutting a bunch of welds. Now, the shape is a little irregular, so I just went ahead and marked it out with my tape measure, and you can see I'm using a big Bessey clamp to clamp those pieces in place and that little magnet to hold it up. I really like this new clamp from Bessey with that big red handle. It really makes it easy to get super tight leverage and a really good grab on material. Now I welded those in pretty hot so that I could get a good penetration from the 3/8 to the 1/2 inch. And then I just used a transfer punch to figure out where I would need to drill and tap my holes to mount this thing to the side. Now, ideally, I wouldn't be drilling and tapping into cast iron like this, but I think because of the way everything's sort of in tension, I really don't think that anything's going to happen. This isn't really something that's going to get sort of abused with a lot of vibration, so I don't think I'm going to have any issues with those bolts. And if I do, I could always reach my hand in from the bottom and actually put nuts on the end of them and really get this thing down super tight. Again, using 1/2-13, getting everything nice and tight, and then just sort of cleaning up some of the burrs that I left on the edge. You can see those other two bolts in the front, and you'll see what those are for in a second. That's going to be for a nice kind of tool rest that's going to go on the front of this. With the base all done, I can use these countersink stainless 1/2 inch bolts, and those are actually going to sit nice and flush, which will keep them out of the way. You can see the way that the vise rotates on that stand. Now I drag this sucker into the other room and loosen those bolts so I could get the tool tray on there. This was one of the reasons why I bought this. I thought this would be great to put small hand tools on. Obviously, this was once for a grinder. And now it's time to weigh this thing and see how heavy of a monstrosity I've built here. I use my little crane scale and my little electric crane to lift this thing up, and I can go ahead and get a reading on it. I figured it was about 250 pounds, but it was 336 pounds all done, which is actually really good because I don't want this thing to move around while I'm working on it because I don't really want to bolt it to the floor just yet. I want to allow it to be somewhat mobile in the shop. Now you can see the real benefit of a swivel jaw vise. Look at the way that it self-adjusts to grab that tapered pin. And the last step here is going to be using some WD-40 Specialist long-term corrosion inhibitor to keep this thing from rusting. Now in the past, you've seen me paint and really kind of make vices look flashy and finished, but in this case, I want this thing to show its patina, and I want this to look like an original piece. I don't need it to be all nice and well painted. I just need it to keep from rusting. So I sprayed on some of that corrosion inhibitor, and then I just sort of wiped it in with a brush and a paper towel. In the end, I'm super thrilled with how this thing came out. It looks amazing, it works amazing, and it's nice and heavy. Thank you to WD-40 brand for sponsoring this video, and if you want to see more of what I'm doing, check me out on Instagram at MakeEverythingShop. See you on the next one.